Docker is going to be the topic that we will talk today, and today we will understand what a port binding is that will allow us to access our containers from localhost. And as you know, Docker is a very famous tool that is used across software engineers and DevOps engineers, so understanding the basics of it is always something that is very recommended, that will really help you to develop your skills. Just before you watch this video, maybe you will consider watching my 40-minute Docker getting started video. This will give you a better idea about what Docker is, and also we go over things like installation that will really help you to understand how Docker works. And so maybe you want to consider watching this one if you never heard about Docker. Let's get started. So first of all, if we want to simulate how Docker networking works, then it makes sense to create at least one container so we will have something to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and create a MongoDB container, so we will have a database instance that we could try to access it, and we will see along the way how the networking works once we create this container. So we will run this in detach mode, and then we will go ahead and say --name equals to Mongo underscore first, and then we will use the image name of Mongo. So this is going to be probably brought from the Docker Hub, which is going to be the repository of images that you can find there hundreds of images that are already ready and accessible to you. So by specifying this, then I'm basically creating a container of Mongo. This might take a few more minutes for yourself because I already downloaded the image of Mongo to my local repository. So wait a minute or two and then you should be good to go. Now by default, when we use a ready product, then we know that there are some ports that those products are using by default. For example, when you execute a Flask application, it uses port 5000 by default, or Django uses 8000 by default, and a Postgres database uses 5432. So a lot of products having their own default port numbers. And for Mongo, it is the number of 27017. So what that means? It means that if we use a command like curl or telnet that will try to access to this port on localhost, then we should expect to see great result because we already have a container that runs on that port. So if we go ahead and use telnet localhost separated by a colon and then specify the port number, then this means that we should have a connection. And this should be space separated, so excuse me for the confusion here, not colon but a space, because the second argument here is the port number that the telnet command expects here. As you can see, the failure identifies that it tried to access this port but it failed. Now, a quick side note, Telnet is something that you can enable on your Windows machine. I added a link in the description that you can follow along if you face with an error like unrecognized command or something like that. So in order to really understand why this doesn't work, then we need to understand how containers work in general once we create them on our local host. We cannot take this for granted that the network configuration for the containers are going to be globally accessed from our local host. So let's understand how we can access our MongoDB database from our local host. So on our local computer, we know that we can run as much as containers as we want. So what we try to do, we try to create a container that uses the MongoDB image, and then basically we try to access it from port 27017. Now the container exposes this port, but again we cannot take for granted that this one is going to be accessible from our local host. And the reason for that, it is because each container by default uses a separated network interface that is not as the same of your network interface, so to speak. So that's why we cannot directly access from here to here. The connection is not going to be established unless we are going to change the behavior. Now you can say, okay, so let's configure this container to execute on the same network interface as the local host. And that's something that usually Docker users avoid for security reasons. And anyway, this is something that is not supported when it comes to executing containers on Windows environments. And that is not so bad because there is a best practice way that you can bind connection between a local host to a container that is running inside your local host. And that is achievable by using the -p argument once you create your containers. So as you can see here, we added this -p argument that is followed by the exact port numbers, but now we can see a colon separator. Now, basically, when we launch a container with this configuration, then what happens is that you basically take the port of 27017 of your host, of your local host, and you bind this into the same port of the container. And so in that way, once you bind the connection from the local host to the container with the same port, then this time it is going to be accessible from your local host. Now take a note that the port that you specify on the left side is always your local host port, and the port you specify in the right side is the port that you specify in the container port. So at the end of the day, if you want to use a different port on your local host for comfort reasons, then you can also go ahead and change this one to something like 8000, and then you can access your MongoDB with port 8000 from your local host, because it will do the bind correctly. But on the right side, you should always specify the port that MongoDB actually uses. So in that way, again, next time that we will do telnet localhost with the port, then we will have a successful connection, because we did this binding port process when we created the MongoDB container. So now that we understood what needs to be fixed, let's go ahead and create a container with the correct port binding information. Now take a note that you cannot delete a container that it is currently running. And this is something that we probably want to do, because otherwise it is just going to be a waste of space, and we will have tons of containers, as the practice goes, that are running for no reason. So we should be stopping the container, and only after that we are allowed to remove it. You cannot remove a container that is running. Think of it like a file that you try to remove from your disk, and the file is busy by a notepad. This is pretty equivalent, right? So you first stop a container, and only after that you can remove it. So let's go ahead and start by saying docker stop mongo underscore first. And once we have done this, then we can say docker rm mongo underscore first, and the container is going to be deleted now. And this time, let's go ahead and again use docker run, and as usual, detach mode. Let's give a name like mongo second, and now we are going to provide here correct port binding information. So we are going to say -p, and exactly like I showed in a minute ago, we are just going to bind the localhost port to that one, right? And this is going to allow us to run the MongoDB in the desired port that we want, which is 27017, and we are going to see in a second that it's going to be accessible. So now let's go ahead and test this out. We are going to use telnet localhost space and then the port that we want to check the connection against. And now if we will press on enter, then you can see that we do not receive any errors, and we are actually in a black screen. That this means in telnet command that connection has been established successfully. So now in order to bring the terminal back, just press enter a couple of times, or Ctrl C or Ctrl break to really continue from here. Okay, so a couple of Ctrl C's done the job. And now to really show you that you can use any port that you would like to on your local host, let's now try to bind the local port number to a different port number rather than the container's port number. So what that means, it means that if I'd like to access MongoDB with the port 8000, then I can do that, right? So first things first, let's see that our port 8000 is not allocated by another service. And that's going to be pretty easy to verify. There are multiple ways to verify this. I will just do telnet localhost 8000, and I will expect for an exception here, and we will receive this just in a second. Okay, so perfect result. And now I'm just going to bring in the previous commands by pressing the up arrow a couple of times. And this time, let's change the container name to Mongo third, because each container should have a unique name. And then we are just going to change this one to 8000, right? And then once we will press on enter here, then if we will run again the previous command, so let's press on up arrow twice. If we execute that, then you can see that we have a connection that has been established. So this is very good, because now you can bind your different containers into the port numbers that you'd like to. And this is just a good option to know, because not always it is easier to remember port numbers that are with 5 digits like with the MongoDB. Okay, so I really hope you enjoyed in this one. Let me know if you have any questions about this video, and also if you want to see more videos like this. And also drop a random comment for the YouTube algorithm. It is going to be very helpful for me. Okay, so hope to see you in my next upload.